Chapter 9 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Steve Bell of Becker, Texas. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox Jr. Chapter 9. It was court day at the county seat across the Kentucky line. Hale had risen early, as everyone must, if he would get his breakfast in the mountains, even in the hotels in the county seats, and he sat with his feet on the railing of the hotel porch which fronted the main street of the town. He had had his heartbreaking failures since the autumn before, but he was in good cheer now, for his feverish enthusiasm had at last clutched a man who would take up not only his options on the great gap beyond Black Mountain. He was riding across from the bluegrass to meet this man at the railroad in Virginia, nearly 200 miles away. Opposite was the brick courthouse, every window lacking at least one pane. The steps yellow with dirt and tobacco juice, the doorway and the bricks about the upper windows bullet-dented and eloquent, with memories of the feud which had long embroiled the whole county. Not that everybody took part in it, but, on the matter, everybody, as an old woman told him, had feelings. It had begun, so he learned, just after the war. Two boys were playing marbles in the road along the Cumberland River, and one had a patch on the seat of his trousers. The other boy made fun of it, and the boy with the patch went home and told his father. As a result, there had already been 30 years of local war. In the last race for legislature, political issues were submerged and the feud was the sole issue. And a Tolliver had carried that boy's trouser patch like a flag to victory and was sitting in the lower house at that time helping to make laws for the rest of the state. Now Bad Roof Tolliver was in the hills again, and the end was not yet. Already people were pouring in. Men, women, and children. The men slouch-hatted and stalking through the mud in the rain, or filing in on horseback, riding double sometimes, 2 men or 2 women, or a man with his wife or daughter behind him, or a woman with a baby in her lap, and 2 more children behind, all dressed in homespun or store clothes, and the paint from artificial flowers on her hat streaking the face of every girl who had unwisely scanned the heavens that morning. Soon the square was filled with hitched horses, and an auctioneer was bidding off cattle, sheep, hogs, and horses to the crowd of mountaineers about him, while the women sold eggs and butter and bought things for use at home. Now and then an open feudsman with a Winchester passed, and many a man was belted with cartridges for the big pistol dangling at his hip. When court opened, the rain ceased, the sun came out, and Hale made his way through the crowd to the battered Temple of Justice. On one corner of the square he could see the chief store of the town marked Buck Falin General Merchandise. And the big man in the door with the bushy red head, he guessed, was the leader of the Falin clan. Outside the door stood a smaller replica of the same figure, whom he recognized as the leader of the band that had nearly ridden him down at the gap when they were looking for young Dave Tolliver the autumn before. That doubtless was young Buck. For a moment he stood at the door of the courtroom. A Falin was on trial, and the grizzled judge was speaking angrily. "This is the 3rd time you've had this trial postponed because you ain't got no lawyer. I ain't gonna put it off. Have you got you a lawyer now?" "Yes, Judge," said the defendant. "Well, where is he?" "Over there on the jury." The judge looked at the man on the jury. "Well, I reckon you better leave him where he is. He'll do you more good there than anywhere else." Hale laughed out loud. The judge glared at him, and he turned quickly upstairs to his work in the deed room. Till noon he worked, and yet there was no trouble. After dinner he went back, and in 2 hours his work was done. An atmospheric difference he felt as soon as he reached the door. The crowd had melted from the square. There were no women in sight, but 8 armed men were in front of the door, and 2 of them, a red Falin and a black Tolliver, Bad Roof it was, were quarreling. In every doorway stood a man cautiously looking on, and in a hotel window he saw a woman's frightened face. It was so still that it seemed impossible that a tragedy could be imminent, and yet, while he was trying to take the conditions in, one of the quarreling men, Bad Roof Tolliver, whipped out his revolver, and before he could level it, a Falin struck the muzzle of a pistol into his back. Another Tolliver flashed his weapon on the Falin. This Tolliver was covered by another Falin, and in so many flashes of lightning, the 8 men in front of him were covering each other. Every man afraid to be the first to shoot, since he knew that the flash of his own pistol meant instantaneous death for him. As Hale shrank back, he pushed against somebody who thrust him aside. It was the judge. "Why don't somebody shoot?" he asked sarcastically. "You're a pretty set of fools, ain't you? I want you all to stop this damn foolishness. Now when I give the word, I want you, Jim Falin, and Rufe Tolliver there, to drop your guns." Already Rufe was grinning like a devil over the absurdity of the situation. "Now," said the judge, and the 2 guns were dropped. "Put 'em in your pockets." They did. "Drop." All dropped, and with those 2 all put up their guns, each man, however, watching now the man who had just been covering him. It is not wise for the stranger to show too much interest in the personal affairs of mountain men, and Hale left the judge berating them and went to the hotel to get ready for the Gap, little dreaming how fixed the faces of some of those men were in his brain and how later they were to rise in his memory again. His horse was lame, but he must go on, so he hired a yaller mule from the landlord, and when the beast was brought around he overheard 2 men talking at the end of the porch. "You don't mean to say they've made peace?" "Yes, Rufe's gone away again, and they shook hands, all of 'em." The other laughed. "Rufe ain't gone yet." The Cumberland River was rain-swollen. The home-going people were helping each other across it, and as Hale approached the ford of a creek half a mile beyond the river, a black-haired girl was standing on a boulder looking helplessly at the yellow water, and 2 boys were on the ground below her. One of them looked up at Hale. "I wish you'd help this lady across." "Certainly," said Hale, and the girl giggled when he laboriously turned his old mule up to the boulder. Not accustomed to have ladies ride behind him, Hale had turned the wrong side. Again he laboriously wheeled around, and then in the yellow torrent he went with the girl behind him, the old beast stumbling over the stones, whereat the girl, unafraid, made sounds of much merriment. Across, Hale stopped and said courteously, "If you are going up this way, you are quite welcome to ride on." "Well, I wasn't crossing that crick just exactly for fun," said the girl demurely, and then she murmured something about her cousins and looked back. They had gone down to a shallower ford, and when they 2 had waded across, they said nothing and the girl said nothing. So Hale started on, the 2 boys following. The mule was slow, and being in a hurry, Hale urged him with his whip. Every time he struck, the beast would kick up, and once the girl came near going off. "You must watch out when I hit him," said Hale. "I don't know when you're going to hit him," she drawled unconcernedly. "Well, I'll let you know," said Hale, laughing. "No!" And as he whacked the beast again, the girl laughed and they were better acquainted. Presently they passed 2 boys. Hale was wearing riding boots and tight breeches, and one of the boys ran his eyes up boot and leg, and if they were lifted higher Hale could not tell. "Where'd you get him?" he squeaked. The girl turned her head as the mule broke into a trot. "Ain't got time to tell. They are my cousins," explained the girl. "What is your name?" asked Hale. "Loretty Tolliver." Hale turned in his saddle. "Are you the daughter of Dave Tolliver?" "Yes." "Then you've got a brother named Dave?" "Yes." This, then, was the sister of the black-haired boy he had seen in the Lonesome Cove. "Haven't you got some kinfolks over the mountain?" "Yes, I got an uncle living over there. Devil Judd, folks calls him," said the girl simply. This girl was cousin to little June in Lonesome Cove. Every now and then she would look behind them, and when Hale turned again inquiringly, she explained, "I'm worried about my cousins back there. I'm afeared something might happen to 'em." "Shall we wait for them?" "Oh no, I reckon not." Soon they overtook 2 men on horseback, and after they had passed and were 50 yards ahead of them, one of the men lifted his voice jestingly. "Is that your woman, stranger, or have you just borrowed her?" Hale shouted back, "No, I'm sorry to say I've just borrowed her," and he turned around to see how she would take his answering pleasantry. She was looking down shyly, and she did not seem much pleased. "They are kinfolks of mine too," she said, and whether it was in explanation or as a rebuke Hale could not determine. "You must be kin to everybody around here." "Most everybody," she said simply. By and by they came to a creek. "I have to turn up here," said Hale. "So do I," she said, smiling now directly at him. "Good," he said, and they went on, Hale asking more questions. She was going to school at the county seat the coming winter, and she was 15 years old. "That's right. The trouble in the mountains is that you girls marry so early that you don't have time to get an education." She wasn't going to marry early, she said, but Hale learned now that she had a sweetheart who had been in town that day, and apparently the 2 had had a quarrel. Who it was she would not tell, and Hale would have been amazed had he known the sweetheart was none other than young Buck Falin, and that the quarrel between the lovers had sprung from the opening quarrel that day between the clans. Once again she came near going off the mule, and Hale observed that she was holding to the cantle of his saddle. "Look here," he said suddenly, "hadn't you better catch hold of me?" She shook her head vigorously and made two not-to-be-rendered sounds that meant, "No, indeed." "Well, if this were your sweetheart, you'd take hold of him, wouldn't you?" Again she gave a vigorous shake of the head. "Well, if he saw you riding behind me, he wouldn't like it, would he?" She didn't care, she said, but Hale did, and when he heard the galloping of horses behind him, saw two men coming, and heard one of them shouting, "Hey, you man on that yaller mule, stop there!" He shifted his revolver, pulled in, and waited with some uneasiness. They came up, reeling in their saddles. Neither one the girl's sweetheart, as he saw at once from her face, and began to ask what the girl characterized afterward as unnecessary questions: who he was, and who she was, and where they were going. Hale answered so shortly that the girl thought there was going to be a fight, and she was on the point of slipping from the mule. "Sit still," said Hale quietly. "There's not going to be a fight so long as you are here." "There ain't," said one of the men. "Well," then he looked sharply at the girl and turned his horse. "Come on, Bill, that's old Dave Tolliver's gal." The girl's face was on fire. "Them mean Falins," she said contemptuously, and somehow the mere fact that Hale had been even for the moment antagonistic to the other faction seemed to put him in the girl's mind at once on her side, and straightway she talked freely of the feud. Devil Judd had taken no active part in it for a long time, she said, except to keep it down, especially since he and her father had had a falling out, and the two families did not visit much, though she and her cousin June sometimes spent the night with each other. "You won't be able to get over there till long after dark," she said, and she caught her breath so suddenly and so sharply that Hale turned to see what the matter was. She searched his face with her black eyes, which were like June's without the depths of June's. "I was just wondering if maybe you wasn't the same feller that was over in Lonesome last fall." "Maybe I am. My name's Hale." The girl laughed. "Well, if this ain't the beatin'est! I've heard June talk about you. My brother Dave don't like you overmuch," she added frankly. "I reckon we'll see Dave purty soon. If this ain't the beatin'est," she repeated, and she laughed again, as she always did laugh, it seemed to Hale, when there was any prospect of getting him into trouble. "You can't get over there till long after dark," she said again presently. "Is there any place on the way where I can get to stay all night?" "You can stay all night with the Red Fox on top of the mountain." "The Red Fox," repeated Hale. "Yes, he lives right on top of the mountain. You can't miss his house." "Oh, yes, I remember him. I saw him talking to one of the Falins in town today, behind the barn when I went to get my horse." "You seed him a-talkin' to a Falin afore the trouble came up?" the girl asked slowly and with such significance that Hale turned to look at her. He felt straightway that he ought not to have said that, and the day was to come when he would remember it to his cost. He knew how foolish it was for the stranger to show sympathy with or interest in one faction or another in a mountain feud, but to give any kind of information of one to the other, that was unwise indeed. Ahead of them now, a little stream ran from a ravine across the road. Beyond was a cabin. In the doorway were several faces, and sitting on a horse at the gate was young Dave Tolliver. "Well, I get down here," said the girl, and before his mule stopped she slid from behind him and made for the gate without a word of thanks or goodbye. "Howdy," said Hale, taking in the group with his glance, but leaving his eyes on young Dave. The rest nodded, but the boy was too surprised for speech, and the spirit of deviltry took the girl when she saw her brother's face, and at the gate she turned. "Much obleeged," she said. "Tell June I'm a-comin' over to see her next Sunday." "I will," said Hale, and he rode on. To his surprise, when he had gone 100 yards, he heard the boys spurring after him, and he looked around inquiringly as young Dave drew alongside. But the boy said nothing, and Hale, amused, kept still, wondering when the lad would open speech. At the mouth of another little creek, the boy stopped his horse as though he was to turn up that way. "You come back again," he said, searching Hale's face with his black eyes. "Yes," said Hale, "I've come back. You going over to Lonesome Cove?" "Yes." The boy hesitated, and a sudden change of mind was plain to Hale in his face. "I wish you'd tell Uncle Judd about the trouble in town today," he said, looking fixedly at Hale. "Certainly." "Did you tell the Red Fox that day you seed him when you was going over to the Gap last fall that you seed me at Uncle Judd's?" "No," said Hale. "But how did you know that I saw the Red Fox that day?" The boy laughed unpleasantly. "So long," he said. "See you again some day." The way was steep, the sun was down, and darkness gathering before Hale reached the top of the mountain. So he hallooed at the yard fence of the Red Fox, who peered cautiously out of the door, and asked his name before he came to the gate. and there, with a grin on his curious mismatched face, he repeated young Dave's words. "You come back again." And Hale repeated his, "Yes, I've come back." "You going over to Lonesome Cove?" "Yes," said Hale impatiently, "I'm going over to Lonesome Cove. Can I stay here all night?" "Sure," said the old man hospitably. "That's a fine hoss you got there," he added with a chuckle. "Been swapping?" Hale had to laugh as he climbed down from the bony, ear-flopping beast. "I left my horse in town. He's lame." "Yes, I seed you thar." Hale could not resist. "Yes, and I seed you." The old man almost turned. "Whar?" Again the temptation was too great. "Talking to the Falin who started the row." This time the Red Fox wheeled sharply and his pale blue eyes filled with suspicion. "I keeps friends with both sides," he said. "Ain't many folks can do that." "I reckon not," said Hale calmly, but in the pale eyes he still saw suspicion. When they entered the cabin a little old woman in black, dumb and noiseless, was cooking supper. The children of the two, he learned, had scattered, and they lived there alone. On the mantel were 2 pistols, and in one corner was the big Winchester he remembered, and behind it was the big brass telescope. On the table was a Bible and a volume of Swedenborg, and among the usual strings of pepper pods and beans and twisted long green tobacco were drying herbs and roots of all kinds, and about the fireplace were bottles of liquids that had been stewed from them. The little old woman served, and opened her lips not at all. Supper was eaten with no further reference to the doings in town that day, and no word was said about their meeting when Hale first went to Lonesome Cove until they were smoking on the porch. "I heerd you found some mighty fine coal over in Lonesome Cove." "Yes." "Young Dave Tolliver thinks you found something else thar, too," chuckled the Red Fox. "I did," said Hale coolly, and the old man chuckled again. "She's a purty little gal, sure." "Who is?" asked Hale, looking calmly at his questioner, and the Red Fox lapsed into baffled silence. The moon was brilliant, and the night was still. Suddenly the Red Fox cocked his ear like a hound, and without a word slipped swiftly within the cabin. A moment later Hale heard the galloping of a horse, and from out the dark woods loped a horseman with a Winchester across his saddle bow. He pulled in at the gate, but before he could shout "Hello," the Red Fox had stepped from the porch into the moonlight and was going to meet him. Hale had never seen a more easy, graceful, daring figure on horseback, and in the bright light he could make out the reckless face of the man who had been the first to flash his pistols in town that day. Bad Rufe Tolliver. For 10 minutes the two talked in whispers. Rufe bent forward with one elbow on the withers of his horse, but lifting his eyes every now and then to the stranger seated in the porch. And then the horseman turned with an oath and galloped into the darkness whence he came, while Red Fox slouched back to the porch and dropped silently into his seat. "Who was that?" asked Hale. "Bad Rufe Tolliver." "I've heard of him. Most everybody in these mountains has. He's the feller that's always causing trouble. Him and Joe Falin agreed to go west last fall to end the war. And now Rufe claims Joe don't count now, and he's got the right to come back. Soon as he comes back, things get frolicsome again. He swore he wouldn't go back unless another Falin goes too. Wirt Falin agreed, and that's how they made peace today. Now Rufe says he won't go at all, truce or no truce. My wife and thar is a Tolliver, but both sides comes to me and I keeps peace with both of them." No doubt he did, Hale thought. Keep peace or mischief with or against anybody with that face of his. That was a common type of a bad man, that horseman who had galloped away from the gate. But this old man with his dual face, who preached the word on Sundays and on other days was a walking arsenal, who dreamed dreams and had visions and slipped through the hills in his mysterious moccasins, on errands of mercy or chasing men from vanity, personal enmity, or for fun, and still appeared so sane, he was a type that confounded. No wonder, for these reasons, and as tribute to his infernal shrewdness, he was known far and wide as the Red Fox of the mountains. But Hale was too tired for further speculation, and presently he yawned. "Want to lay down?" asked the old man quickly. "I think I do," said Hale, and they went inside. The old man had her face to the wall and the bed in one corner, and the Red Fox pointed to a bed in the other. "Thar's your bed." Again Hale's eyes fell on the big Winchester. "Want to lay down?" asked the old man quickly. "I think I do," said Hale, and they went inside. The little old woman had her face to the wall and a bed in one corner, and the Red Fox pointed to a bed in the other. "Thar's your bed." Again Hale's eyes fell on the big Winchester. "I reckon there ain't more'n 2 others like it in all these mountains." "What's the caliber?" "Biggest made," was the answer, "a 50 by a 75. "Centerfire?" "Rim," said the Red Fox. "Gracious," laughed Hale, "what do you want such a big one for?" "Man cannot live by bread alone in these mountains," said the Red Fox grimly. When Hale lay down he could hear the old man quavering out a hymn or two on the porch outside, and when worn out with the day he went to sleep. The Red Fox was reading his Bible by the light of a tallow dip. It is fatefully strange when people, whose lives tragically intersect, look back to their first meetings with one another, and Hale never forgot that night in the cabin of the Red Fox, for had Bad Roof Tolliver, while he whispered at the gate, known the part the quiet young man silently seated in the porch would play in his life, he would have shot him where he sat. And could the Red Fox have known the part his sleeping guest was to play in his, the old man would have knifed him where he lay. It is fatefully strange when people whose lives tragically intersect look back to their first meetings with one another, and Hale never forgot that night in the cabin of the Red Fox, for had Bad Roof Tolliver, while he whispered at the gate, known the part the quiet young man silently seated in the porch would play in his life, he would have shot him where he sat. And could the Red Fox have known the part his sleeping guest was to play in his, the old man would have knifed him where he lay. End of Chapter 9. Recording by Steve Bell, Becker, Texas.
Chapter 10 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Brian Keith Barnes. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox. Chapter 10. Hale opened his eyes next morning on the little old woman in black, moving ghost-like through the dim interior to the kitchen. A wood thrush was singing when he stepped out on the porch, and its cool notes had the liquid freshness of the morning. Breakfast over, he concluded to leave the yellow mule with the Red Fox to be taken back to the county town and to walk down the mountain. But before he got away, the landlord's son turned up with his own horse, still lame, but well enough to limp along without doing himself harm. So, leading the black horse, Hale started down. The sun was rising over still seas of white mist and wave after wave of blue Virginia hills. In the shadows below, it smote the mists into tatters. Leaf and bush glittered as though after a heavy rain. And down Hale went, under a trembling, dew-drenched world, and along a tumbling series of waterfalls that flashed through tall ferns, blossoming laurel and shining leaves of rhododendron. Once he heard something move below him, and then the crackling of brush sounded far to one side of the road. He knew it was a man who would be watching him from a covert, and straightway, to prove his innocence of any hostile or secret purpose, he began to whistle. Further below, two men with Winchesters rose from the bushes and asked his name and his business. He told both readily. Everybody, it seemed, was prepared for hostilities, and though the news of the patched-up peace had spread, it was plain that the factions were still suspicious and on guard. Then the loneliness almost of Lonesome Cove itself set in. For miles he saw nothing alive but an occasional bird, and heard no sound but of running water or rustling leaf. At the mouth of the creek his horse's lameness had grown so much better that he mounted him and rode slowly up the river. Within an hour he could see the still crest of the Lonesome Pine. At the mouth of a creek a mile further on was an old gristmill with its water wheel asleep. And whittling at the door outside was the old miller, Uncle Billy Beams, who, when he heard the coming of the black horse's feet, looked up and showed no surprise at all when he saw Hale.
"I heard you was coming,"
he shouted, hailing him cheerily by name.
"Ain't fishing this time."
"No," said Hale. "Not this time."
"Well, get down and rest a spell. June'll be here in a minute, and you can ride back with her. I reckon you're going that-a-way."
"June?"
"Sure. My, but she'll be glad to see you. She's always talking about you. You told her you was coming back, and everybody told her you wasn't. But that little gal always said she knowed you was because you said you was."
"She's growed some, and if she ain't purty, well, I'd tell a man."
You just tie your horse up there behind the mill so she can't see it, and get inside the mill when she comes around that bend there. My, but it'll be a surprise for her." The old man chuckled so cheerily that Hale, to humor him, hitched his horse to a sapling, came back, and sat in the door of the mill. The old man knew all about the trouble in town the day before. "I want to give you a little advice. Keep your mouth plumb shut about this here war. I'm justice of the peace, but that's the only way I've kept out in it for 30 years, and it's the only way you can keep out in it." "Thank you. I mean to keep my mouth shut, but would you mind—" "Get in,"
interrupted the old man eagerly.
"Here she comes."
His kind old face creased into a welcoming smile, and between the logs of the mill, Hale, inside, could see an old sorrel horse slowly coming through the lights and shadows down the road. On its back was a sack of corn, and perched on the sack was a little girl with her bare feet in the hollows behind the old nag's withers. She was looking sidewise, quite hidden by a scarlet poke bonnet, and at the old man's shout she turned the smiling face of little June. With an answering cry, she struck the old nag with a switch, and before the old man could rise to help her down, slipped lightly to the ground.
"Why, honey," he said, "I don't know what I'm going to do your corn. Shaft's broke, and I can't do no grinding till tomorrow." "Well, Uncle Billy, we ain't got a pint of meal in the house," she said. "You just got to lend me some." "All right, honey," said the old man, and he cleared his throat, a signal for Hale.
The little girl was pushing her bonnet back when Hale stepped into sight, and, unstartled, unsmiling, unspeaking, she looked steadily at him, one hand motionless for a moment on her bronze heap of hair, and then slipping down past her cheek to clench the other tightly. Uncle Billy was bewildered.
"Why, June, it's Mr. Hale, why—"
"Howdy, June," said Hale, who was no less puzzled. And still she gave no sign that she had ever seen him before, except reluctantly to give him her hand. Then she turned sullenly away and sat down in the door of the mill with her elbows on her knees and her chin in her hands. Dumbfounded, the old miller pulled the sack of corn from the horse and leaned it against the mill. Then he took out his pipe, filled and lighted it slowly, and turned his perplexed eyes to the sun.
"Well, honey,"
he said, as though he were doing the best he could with a difficult situation,
"I'll have to get you that meal at the house. About dinner time now. You and Mr. Harold there, come on and get something to eat before you go back." "I got to get on back home," said June, rising. "No, you ain't. I bet you got dinner for your stepmammy afore you left, and I just know you was aiming to take a snack with me and old Hun."
The little girl hesitated. She had no denial, and the old fellow smiled kindly.
"Come on now."
Little June walked on the other side of the miller from Hale, back to the old man's cabin 200 yards up the road, answering his questions, but not Hale's, and never meeting the latter's eyes with her own. Old Hun, the portly old woman whom Hale remembered with brass-rimmed spectacles and a clay pipe in her mouth, came out on the porch and welcomed them heartily under the honeysuckle vines. Her mouth and face were alive with humor when she saw Hale, and her eyes took in both him and the little girl keenly. The miller and Hale leaned chairs against the wall, while the girl sat at the entrance of the porch. Suddenly, Hale went out to his horse and took out a package from his saddle pockets. "I've got some candy in here for you," he said, smiling.
"I don't want no candy,"
she said, still not looking at him and with a little movement of her knees away from him.
"Why, honey," said Uncle Billy again, "what is the matter with ye? I thought ye was great friends."
The little girl rose hastily.
"No, we ain't, nuther,"
she said, and she whisked herself indoors. Hale put the package back with some embarrassment, and the old miller laughed.
Well, she's a queer little critter. Maybe she's mad because you stayed away so long."
At the table, June wanted to help old Hun and wait to eat with her, but Uncle Billy made her sit down with him and Hale, and so shy was she that she hardly ate anything. Only once did she look up from her plate And that was when Uncle Billy, with a shake of his head, said, "He's a bad one." He was speaking of Rufe Tolliver, and at the mention of his name there was a frightened look in the little girl's eyes, when she quickly raised them, that made Hale wonder. An hour later they were riding side by side, Hale and June, on through the lights and shadows toward Lonesome Cove. Uncle Billy turned back from the gate to the porch. "He ain't come back yet just for coal," said old Hun. "Shucks," said Uncle Billy. "You women folks can't think about nothing except one thing. He's too old for her." "She'll get old enough for him, and you men folks don't think less. You just talk less." And she went back into the kitchen, and on the porch the old miller puffed on a new idea in his pipe. For a few moments the two rode in silence, and not yet had June lifted her eyes to him. "You've forgotten me, June." "No, I ain't, nuther." "You said you'd be waiting for me." June's lashes went lower still. "I was." "Well, what's the matter? I'm mighty sorry I couldn't get back sooner." "Heh," said June scornfully, and he knew Uncle Billy and his guess as to the trouble was far afield, so he tried another tack. "I've been over to the county seat, and I saw lots of your kinfolks over there." She showed no curiosity, no surprise, and still she did not look up at him. "I met your cousin, Loretta, over there, and I carried her home behind me on an old mule." Hale paused, smiling at the remembrance, and still she betrayed no interest. "She's a mighty pretty girl, and whenever I'd hit that old—" "She ain't!" The words were so shrieked out that Hale was bewildered, and then he guessed that the falling out between the fathers was more serious than he had supposed. "But she isn't as nice as you are," he added quickly, and the girl's quivering mouth steadied. The tears stopped in her vexed dark eyes, and she lifted them to him at last. "She ain't?" "No, indeed, she ain't." For a while they rode along again in silence. June no longer avoided his eyes now, and the unspoken question in her own presently came out. "You won't let Uncle Rufe bother me no more, will ye?" "No, indeed I won't," said Hale heartily. "What does he do to you?" "Nothing, except he's always a-teasing me, and I'm afeard of him." "Well, I'll take care of Uncle Rufe." "I know you'd say that," she said. "Pap and Dave always laughs at me." And she shook her head as though she were already threatening her bad uncle with what Hale would do to him. And she was so serious and trustful that Hale was curiously touched. By and by he lifted one flap of his saddle pockets again. "I've got some candy here for a nice little girl," he said, as though the subject had not been mentioned before. "It's for you. Won't you have some?" "I reckon I will," she said with a happy smile. Hale watched her while she munched a striped stick of peppermint. Her crimson bonnet had fallen from her sunlit hair, and straight down from it to her bare little foot, with its stubbed toe just darkening with dried blood, a sculptor would have loved the rounded slenderness in the curving long lines that shaped her brown throat, her arms, and her hands, which were prettily shaped, but so very dirty as to the nails, and her dangling bare leg. Her teeth were even and white, and most of them flashed when her red lips smiled. Her lashes were long and gave a touching softness to her eyes, even when she was looking quietly at him. But there were times, as he had noticed already, when a brooding look stole over them, and then they were the lair for the mysterious loneliness that was the very spirit of Lonesome Cove. Some day that little nose would be long enough, and some day, he thought, she would be very beautiful. "Your cousin Loretta, she was coming over to see you." June's teeth snapped viciously through the stick of candy, and then she turned on him, and behind the long lashes and deep down in the depth of those wonderful eyes, he saw an ageless something that bewildered him more than her words. "I hate her," she said fiercely. "Why, little girl?" he said gently. "I don't know," she said. And then the tears came in earnest as she turned her head, sobbing. Hale helplessly reached over and patted her on the shoulder, but she shrank away from him. "Go away," she said, digging her fist into her eyes until her face was calm again. They had reached the spot on the river where he had seen her first, and beyond, the smoke of the cabin was rising above the undergrowth. "Lordy," she said, "but I do get lonesome over here." "Wouldn't you like to go over to the Gap with me sometimes?" Straightway her face was a ray of sunlight. "Would I like to go over?" She stopped suddenly and pulled in her horse, but Hale had heard nothing. "Hello!" shouted a voice from the bushes, and Devil Judd Tolliver issued from them with an axe on his shoulder. "I heerd you'd come back, and I'm glad to see you." He came down to the road and shook Hale's hand heartily. "What you been crying about?" he added, turning his hawk-like eyes on the little girl. "Nothing," she said sullenly. "Did she get mad with you about something?" said the old man to Hale. "She never cries except when she's mad." Hale laughed. "You just hush up, both of you," said the girl with a sharp kick of her right foot. "I reckon you can't stamp the ground that fur away from it," said the old man dryly. "If you don't get the better of that all-fired temper of yourn, it's going to get the better of you, and then I'll have to spank you again." "I reckon you ain't going to whoop me no more, Pap. I'm a-getting too big." The old man opened eyes and mouth with an indulgent roar of laughter. "Come on up to the house," he said to Hale, turning to lead the way, the little girl following him. The old stepmother was again abed. Small Bub, the brother, still unafraid, sat down beside Hale, and the old man brought out a bottle of moonshine. "I reckon I can trust ye," he said. "I reckon you can," laughed Hale. The liquor was as fiery as ever, but it was grateful, and again the old man took nearly a tumblerful, plying Hale, meanwhile, about the happenings in town the day before. But Hale could tell him nothing that he seemed not already to know. "It was quar," the old mountaineer said. "I seed two men with the drap on each other and both afeared to shoot, but I never heerd of such a ring around the rosy as 8 fellers would beat on one another and not a shoot shot. I'm glad I wasn't there." He frowned when Hale spoke of the red fox. "You can't never tell whether that old devil is for ye or agin ye, but I've been plumb sick of these doin's a long time now, and sometimes I think I'll just pull up stakes and go west and get out of it altogether." "How did you learn so much about yesterday so soon?" We hear things pretty quick in these mountains. Little Dave Tolliver come over here last night." "Yes," broke in Bub, "and he told us how you carried Loretty from town on a mule behind you, and she just assassin you, and as how she said she was a-goin' to get you for her sweetheart." Hale glanced by chance at the little girl. Her face was scarlet, and a light dawned. "And Sis there said he was a-tellin' lies, and when she growed up she was a-goin' to marry—" Something snapped like a toy pistol, and Bub howled. A little brown hand had whacked him across the mouth, and the girl flashed indoors without a word. Bub got to his feet howling with pain and rage and started after her, but the old man caught him. "Sit down, boy. Served you right for blabbing things that ain't your business." He shook with laughter. Jealousy. Great heavens, Hale thought, and that child, and for him. "I knowed she was crying about something like that. She set a great store by you, and she studied them books you sent her plumb to pieces while you was away. She ain't nothing but a baby, but in certain ways she's as old as her mother was when she died." The amazing secret was out, and the little girl appeared no more until supper time, when she had waited on the table, but at no time would she look at Hale or speak to him again. For a while, the two men sat on the porch talking of the feud and the Gap and the coal on the old man's place, and Hale had no trouble getting an option for a year on the old man's land. Just as dusk was setting, he got his horse. "You better stay all night." "No, I'll have to get along." The little girl did not appear to tell him goodbye, and when he went to his horse at the gate, he called, "Tell June to come down here. I've got something for her." "Come on, baby," the old man said, and the little girl came shyly down to the gate. Hale took a brown paper parcel from his saddlebags, unwrapped it, and betrayed the usual blue-eyed, flaxen-haired, rosy-cheeked doll. Only June did not know the like of it was in all the world. As she caught it to her breast, there were tears once more in her uplifted eyes. "How about going over the gap with me, little girl, some day?" He never guessed it, but there were a child and a woman before him now, and both answered, "I'll go with ye anywhere." Hale stopped a while to rest his horse at the base of the big pine. He was practically alone in the world. The little girl back there was born for something else than slow death in that God-forsaken cove, and, whatever it was, why not help her to it if he could? With this thought in his brain, he rode down from the luminous upper world of the moon and stars toward the nether world of drifting mists and black ravines. She belonged to just such a night, that little girl. She was a part of its mists, its lights and shadows, its fresh wild beauty and its mystery. Only once did his mind shift from her to his great purpose, and that was when the roar of the water through the rocky chasm of the gap made him think of the roar of iron wheels that, rushing through, some day would drown it into silence. At the mouth of the gap he saw the white valley lying at peace in the moonlight, and straight away from it sprang again, as always, his castle in the air. But before he fell asleep in his cottage on the edge of the mill pond that night, he heard quite plainly again, "I'll go with ye anywhere." End of chapter 10.
Chapter 11, Trail of the Lonesome Pine, by John Fox, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Spring was coming, and meanwhile, that late autumn and short winter, things went merrily on at the Gap in some ways, and in some ways not. Within 8 miles of the place, for instance, the man fell ill, the man who was to take up Hale's options, and he had to be taken home. Still, Hale was undaunted. Here he was, and here he would stay, and he would try again. 2 other young men, bluegrass Kentuckians, Logan and McFarlane, had settled at the Gap, both lawyers and both of pioneer Indian fighting blood. The report of the state geologist had been spread broadcast. A famous magazine writer had come through on horseback and had gone home and given a fervid account of the riches and the beauty of the region. Helmeted Englishmen began to prowl prospectively around the Gap 60 miles to the southwest. New surveying parties were directing lines for the rocky gateway between the iron ore and the coal. Engineers and coal experts passed in and out. There were rumors of a furnace and a steel plant when the railroad should reach the place. Capital had flowed in from the east, and already a Pennsylvanian was starting a main entry into a 10-foot vein of coal up through the Gap and was coking it. His report was that his own was better than the Connellsville coke, which was the standard. It was higher in carbon and lower in ash. The Ludlow brothers from eastern Virginia had started a general store. Two of the Berkeley brothers had come over from Bluegrass, Kentucky, and their family was coming in the spring. The bearded senator up the valley, who was also a preacher, had got his Methodist brethren interested, and the community was further enriched by the coming of the Honorable Samuel Budd, lawyer and budding statesman. As a recreation, the Honorable Sam was an anthropologist. He knew the mountaineers from Virginia to Alabama, and they were his pet illustrations of his pet theories of the effect of a mountain environment on human life and character. Hale took a great fancy to him from the first moment he saw his smooth, ageless, kindly face, surmounted by a huge pair of spectacles that were hooked behind two large ears, above which his pale yellow hair, parted in the middle, was drawn back with plaster-like precision. A mayor and constable had been appointed, and the Honorable Sam had just finished his first case, Squire Morton and the Widow Crane, who ran a boarding house, each having laid claim to 3 pigs that had obstructed traffic in the town. The Honorable Sam was sitting by the stove, deep in thought, when Hale came into the hotel, and he lifted his great glaring lenses and waited for no introduction. "Brother," he said, "do you know 12 reliable witnesses come on the stand and swore them pigs belonged to the squire's sow, and 12 equally reliable witnesses swore them pigs belonged to the Widow Crane's sow? I shorely was a heap perplexed." "That was curious," the Honorable Sam laughed. "Well, sir, them intelligent pigs used both them sows as mothers, and maybe they had another mother somewhere else. They would breakfast with the Widow Crane's sow and take supper with the squire's sow. And so them witnesses, too, was naturally perplexed." Hale waited while the Honorable Sam puffed his pipe into a glow. "Believing as I do that the most important principle in law is mutually forgiven and a square division of spoils, I suggested a compromise. The widow said the squire was an old rascal and thief, and he'd never sink a tooth into one of them shoats, but that her lawyer was a gentleman, meaning me, and the squire said the widow had been blackguarding him all over town, and he'd see her in heaven before she got one, but that his lawyer was a prince of the realm, so the other lawyer took one and I got the other." "What became of the third?" The Honorable Sam was an ardent disciple of Sir Walter Scott. "Well, just now the mayor is a-playing girth to that little runt for costs." Outside, the wheels of the stage rattled, and as half a dozen strangers trooped in, the Honorable Sam waved his hand. "Things is comin'." Things were coming. The following week the booming editor brought in a printing press and started a paper. An enterprising Hoosier soon established a brick plant. A geologist, Hale's predecessor in Lonesome Cove, made the Gap his headquarters, and one by one the vanguard of engineers, surveyors, speculators, and coalmen drifted in. The wings of progress began to sprout, but the new town constable soon tendered his resignation with informality and violence. He had arrested a Falin, whose companions straightway took him from custody and set him free. Straightway the constable threw his pistol and badge of office to the ground. "I've fit and I've hollered for help," he shouted, almost crying with rage, "and I've fit again. Now this town can go to hell." And he picked up his pistol, but left his symbol of law and order in the dust. Next morning there was a new constable, and only that afternoon, when Hale stepped into the Ludlow Brothers' store, he found the constable already busy. A line of men with revolver or knife in sight was drawn up inside with their backs to Hale, and beyond them he could see the new constable with a man under arrest. Hale had not forgotten his promise to himself, and he began now. "Come on," he called quietly, and when the men turned at the sound of his voice, the constable, who was of sterner stuff than his predecessor, pushed through them, dragging his man after him. "Look here, boys," said Hale calmly. "Let's not have any row. Let him go to the mayor's office. If he isn't guilty, the mayor will let him go. If he is, the mayor will give him bond. I'll go on it myself. But let's not have a row." Now, to the mountain eye, Hale appeared no more than the ordinary man, and even a close observer would have seen no more than that his face was clean-cut and thoughtful, that his eye was blue and singularly clear and fearless, and that he was calm with the calmness that might come from anything else than stolidity of temperament. And that, by the way, is the self-control which counts most against the unruly passions of other men. But anybody near Hale, at a time when excitement was high and a crisis was imminent, would have felt the resultant of forces emanating from him that were beyond analysis. And so it was now. The curious power he instinctively had over rough men had its way. "Go on," he continued quietly, and the constable went on with his prisoner, his friends following, still swearing, and with their weapons in their hands. When constable and prisoner passed into the mayor's office, Hale stepped quickly after them and turned on the threshold with his arm across the door. "Hold on, boys," he said, still good-naturedly. "The mayor can attend to this, and if you boys want to fight anybody, fight me. I'm unarmed, and you can whip me easily enough," he added, with a laugh. But you mustn't come in here," he concluded, as though the matter was settled beyond further discussion. For one instant, the crucial one, of course, the men hesitated, for the reason that so often makes superior numbers of no avail among the lawless, the lack of a leader of nerve. And without another word Hale held the door. But the frightened mayor inside let the prisoner out at once on bond, and Hale, combining law and diplomacy, went on the bond. Only a day or two later the Mountaineers, who worked at the brick plant with pistols buckled around them, went on strike, and that night shot out the lights and punctured the chromos in their boarding house. Then, armed with sticks, knives, clubs, and pistols, they took a triumphant march through town. That night 2 knives and 2 pistols were whipped out by 2 of them in the same store. One of the Ludlows promptly blew out the light, and astutely got under the counter. When the combatants scrambled outside, he locked the door and crawled out the back window. Next morning the brickyard malcontents marched triumphantly again, and Hale called for volunteers to arrest them. To his disgust, only Logan, McFarlane, the Honorable Sam Budd, and 2 or 3 others seemed willing to go. But when the few who would go started, Hale, leading them, looked back, and the whole town seemed to be strung out after him. Below the hill he saw the Mountaineers drawn up in 2 bodies for battle, and as he led his followers towards them, the Hoosier owner of the plant rode out at a gallop, waving his hands, and apparently beside himself with anxiety and terror. "Don't!" he shouted. "Somebody'll get killed. Wait! They'll give up." So Hale halted, and the Hoosier rode back. After a short parley, he came back to Hale to say that the strikers would give up, but when Logan started again, they broke and ran, and only 3 or 4 were captured. The Hoosier was delirious over his troubles, and straightway closed his plant. "See," said Hale in disgust, "we got to do something now." "We have," said the lawyers, and that night on Hale's porch the three, with the Honorable Sam Budd, pondered the problem. They could not build a town without law and order. They could not have law and order without taking part themselves, and even then they plainly would have had their hands full. And so that night, on the tiny porch of the little cottage that was Hale's sleeping room and office, with the creaking of the one wheel of their one industry, the old grist mill, making patient music through the rhododendron darkness that hid the steep bank of the stream, the three pioneers forged their plan. There had been gentlemen regulators aplenty, vigilance committees of gentlemen, and the Ku Klux Klan had been originally composed of gentlemen, as they all knew, but they meant to hew to the strict line of town ordinance and common law and do the rough everyday work of the common policeman. So volunteer policemen they would be, and in order to extend their authority as much as possible, as county policemen they would be enrolled. Each man would purchase his own Winchester, pistol, billy, badge, and a whistle to call for help, and they would begin drilling and target shooting at once. The Honorable Sam shook his head dubiously. "The natives won't understand." "We can't help that," said Hale. "I know. I'm with you." Hale was made captain, Logan first lieutenant, McFarland second, and the Honorable Sam third. Two rules Logan, who, too, knew the Mountaineer well, suggested as inflexible. One was never to draw a pistol at all unless necessary, never to pretend to draw as a threat or to intimidate, and never to draw unless one meant to shoot if need be. "And the other," added Logan, "always go in force to make an arrest, never alone unless necessary." The Honorable Sam moved his head up and down in hearty approval. "Why is that?" asked Hale. "To save bloodshed," he said. "These fellows we will have to deal with have a pride that is morbid. A mountaineer doesn't like to go home and have to say that one man put him in the calaboose, but he doesn't mind telling that it took several to arrest him. Moreover, he will give in to two or three men when he would look on the coming of one man as a personal issue and to be met as such." Hale nodded. "Oh, there'll be plenty of chances," Logan added with a smile, "for everyone to go it alone." Again the Honorable Sam nodded grimly. It was plain to him that they would have all they could do, but no one of them dreamed of the far-reaching effect that night's work would bring. They were the vanguard of civilization, crusaders of 19th century against the benighted of the Middle Ages, said the Honorable Sam, and when Logan and McFarland left, he lingered and lit his pipe. "The trouble will be," he said slowly, "that they won't understand our purpose or our methods. They will look on us as a lot of meddlesome furriners who come in to run their country as we please, when they have been running it as they please for more than 100 years. You see, you mustn't judge them by the standards of today. You must go back to the standards of the Revolution. Practically they are the pioneers of that day, and hardly a bit have they advanced. They are our contemporary ancestors." And then the Honorable Sam, having dropped his vernacular, lounged ponderously into what he was pleased to call his anthropological drool. "You see, mountains isolate people, and the effect of isolation on human life is to crystallize it. Those people over the line have had no navigable rivers, no lakes, no wagon roads, except often the beds of streams. They have been cut off from all communication with the outside world. They are a perfect example of an arrested civilization, and they are the closest link we have with the old world. They were Unionists because of the Revolution, as they were Americans in the beginning because of the spirit of the Covenanter. They live like the pioneers. The axe and the rifle are still their weapons, and they still have the same fight with nature. This feud business is a matter of clan loyalty that goes back to Scotland. They argue this way. You are my friend or my kinsman, your quarrel is my quarrel, and whoever hits you, hits me. If you are in trouble, I must not testify against you. If you are an officer, you must not arrest me. You must send me a kindly request to come into court. If I'm innocent, and it's perfectly convenient, why, maybe I'll come. Yes, we're the vanguard of civilization, all right. But, I opine, we're going to have a hell of a merry time. Hale laughed, but he was to remember those words of the Honorable Samuel Budd. Other members of that vanguard began to drift in now by twos and threes from the bluegrass region of Kentucky and from the tidewater country of Virginia and from New England, strong, bold young men with the spirit of the pioneer and the birth, breeding, and education of gentlemen, and the war between civilization and lawlessness that was the result of isolation, and consequent ignorance and idleness started in earnest. A remarkable array, murmured the Honorable Sam, when he took an inventory one night with Hale. I'm proud to be among 'em. Many times Hale went over to Lonesome Cove, and with every visit his interest grew steadily in the little girl and in the curious people over there, until he actually began to believe in the Honorable Sam Budd's anthropological theories. In the cabin on Lonesome Cove was a crane swinging in the big stone fireplace, and he saw the old stepmother and June putting the spinning wheel and the loom to actual use. Sometimes he found a cabin of unhewn logs with a puncheon floor, clapboards for shingles, and wooden pin and auger holes for nails. A batten wooden shutter, the logs filled with mud and stones and holes in the roof for the wind and the rain. Over a pair of buck antlers sometimes lay the long, heavy, homemade rifle of the backwoodsman, sometimes even with a flintlock and called by some pet feminine name. Once he saw the hominy block that the Mountaineers had borrowed from the Indians, and once a hand mill like the one from which the one woman was taken and the other left in biblical days. He struck communities where the medium of exchange was still barter, and he found mountaineers drinking metheglin still as moonshine. Moreover, there were still log rollings, house warmings, corn shuckings, and quilting parties, and sports were the same as in pioneer days: wrestling, racing, jumping, and lifting barrels. Once he saw a cradle of bee gum, and old Judd had in his house a foxhorn made of hickory bark which even June could blow. He ran across old world superstitions, too, and met one seventh son of a seventh son who cured children of rash by blowing into their mouths. And he got June to sing transatlantic songs, after old Judd said one day that she knowed the miserablest song he'd ever heard, meaning the most sorrowful. And thereupon, with quaint simplicity, June put her heels on the rung of her chair, and with her elbows on her knees and her chin on both bent thumbs, sang him the oldest version of Barbara Allen, in a voice that startled Hale by its power and sweetness. She knew lots more song ballets, she said shyly, and the old man had her sing some songs that were rather rude, but were as innocent as hymns from her lips. Everywhere he found unlimited hospitality. "Take out, stranger," said the one old fellow, when there was nothing on the table but some bread and a few potatoes. "Have a tater. Take 2 of 'em. Take damn nigh all of them." Moreover, their pride was morbid, and they were very religious. Indeed, they used religion to cloak their deviltry, as honestly as it was ever used in history. He had heard old Judd say once, when he was speaking of the feud, "Well, I've allus laid out my enemies. The Lord's been on my side, and I gets a better Christian every year." Always Hale took some children's book for June when he went to Lonesome Cove, and she rarely failed to know it almost by heart when he went again. She was so intelligent that he began to wonder if, in her case, at least, another of the Honorable Sam's theories might not be true, that the Mountaineers were of the same class as the other westward sweeping emigrants of more than a century before, that they had simply lain dormant in the hills, and, a century counting for nothing in the matter of inheritance, that their possibilities were little changed, and that the children of that day would, if given the chance, wipe out the handicap of a century in one generation, and take their place abreast with children of the outside world. The Tollivers were of good blood. They had come from eastern Virginia, and the original Tolliver had been a slave owner. The very name was, undoubtedly, a corruption of Tagliaferro. So, when the Widow Crane began to build a brick house for her boarders that winter, and the foundations of a schoolhouse were laid at the Gap, Hale began to plead with old Judd to allow June to go over to the Gap and go to school, but the old man was firm in refusal. "He couldn't get along without her," he said. "He was afeared he'd lose her, and he reckoned June was a larnin' enough without goin' to school. She was a studyin' them little books of hers so hard." But as his confidence in Hale grew, and as Hale stated his intention to take an option on the old man's coal lands, he could see that Devil Judd, though his answer never varied, was considering the question seriously. Through the winter, then, Hale made occasional trips to Lonesome Cove, and bided his time. Often he met young Dave Tolliver there, but the boy usually left when Hale came, and if Hale was already there, he kept outside the house until the engineer was gone. Knowing nothing of the ethics of courtship in the mountains, how, when 2 men meet at the same girl's house, they makes the gal say which one she likes best and t'other one gets, Hale little dreamed that the first time Dave stalked out of the room, he threw his hat in the grass behind the big chimney and executed a war dance on it, cursing the blankety-blank furriner within from Dan to Beersheba. Indeed, he never suspected the fierce depths of the boy's jealousy at all, and he would have laughed incredulously if he had been told, time after time, as he climbed the mountain homeward, the boy's black eyes burned from the bushes on him, while his hand twitched at his pistol butt and his lips worked with noiseless threats. For Dave had to keep his heart burnings to himself, or he would have been laughed at through all the mountains, and not only by his own family, but by June's. So he, too, bided his time. In late February, old Buck Falin and old Dave Tolliver shot each other down in the road, and the Red Fox, who hated both and whom each thought was his friend, dressed the wounds of both with equal care. The temporary lull of peace that Bad Ruth's absence in the west had brought about gave way to a threatening storm then, and then it was that old Judd gave his consent. When the roads got better, June could go to the Gap to school. A month later the old man sent word that he did not want June in the mountains while the trouble was going on, and that Hale could come over for her when he pleased. And Hale sent word back that within 3 days he would meet the father and the little girl at the Big Pine. That last stay at home June passed in a dream. She went through her daily tasks in a dream, and she hardly noticed young Dave when he came in at midday, and Dave, when he heard the news, left in sullen silence. In the afternoon she went down to the mill to tell Uncle Billy and old Hon good-bye, and the three sat in the porch a long time and with few words. Old Hon had been to the Gap once, but there was so much bustle over there made her head ache. Uncle Billy shook his head doubtfully over June's going, and the two old people stood at the gate looking long after the little girl when she went homeward up the road. Before supper June slipped up to her little hiding place at the pool, and sat on the old log, saying good-bye to the comforting spirit that always brooded for her there. And when she stood on the porch at sunset, a new spirit was coming on the wings of the south wind. Hale felt it as he stepped into the soft night air. He heard it in the piping of frogs, marsh birds, as he always called them. He could almost see it in the flying clouds and the moonlight, and even the bare trees seemed tremulously expectant. An indefinable happiness seemed to pervade the whole earth, and Hale stretched his arms lazily. Over in Lonesome Cove, little June felt it more keenly than ever in her life before. She did not want to go to bed that night, and when the others were asleep, she slipped out to the porch and sat on the steps, her eyes luminous and her face wistful, looking towards the big pine, which pointed the way towards the far silence into which she was going at last. End of Chapter 11. The Trail of Lonesome Pine. Read by Bologna Times.
Chapter 12 of The Trail of the Lonesome Pine. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Trail of the Lonesome Pine by John Fox, Jr. Chapter 12. June did not have to be awakened that morning. At the first clarion call of the old rooster behind the cabin, her eyes opened wide and a happy thrill tingled her from head to foot. Why? She didn't at first quite realize, and then she stretched her slender round arms to full length above her head, and with a little squeal of joy bounded out of the bed, dressed as she was when she went into it, and with no changes to make except to push back her tangled hair. Her father was out feeding the stock, and she could hear her stepmother in the kitchen. Bub still slept soundly, and she shook him by the shoulder. "Get up, Bub." "No way," said Bub fretfully. Again she started to shake him, but stopped. Bud wasn't going to the Gap, so she let him sleep. For a little while she looked down at him, at his round, rosy face, and his frowsy hair from under which protruded one dirty fist. She was going to leave him, and a fresh tenderness for him made her breast heave. But she did not kiss him, for sisterly kisses are hardly known in the hills. Then she went out into the kitchen to help her stepmother. "Getting mighty busy all of a sudden, ain't ye?" said the sour old woman. "Now that ye are going away." "'Tain't costing you nothing," answered June quietly, and she picked up a pail and went out into the frosty, shivering daybreak to the old well. The chain froze her fingers, the cold water splashed her feet, and when she had tugged her heavy burden back to the kitchen, she held her red, chapped hands to the fire. "Reckon you'll be mighty glad to get shed of me," the old woman sniffled, and June looked around with a start. "'Pears like I'm going to miss you right smart," she quavered, and June's face colored with a new feeling toward her stepmother. "I'm going to have a hard time doing all the work, and me so poorly." "Loretty is coming over to help ye if you get sick," said June, hardening again. "Or I'll come back myself." She got out the dishes and set them on the table. "You and me didn't get along very well together," she went on placidly. "I never heerd of no stepmother and children as did, and I reckon you'll be mighty glad to get shed of me." "'Pears I'm going to miss you right smart," repeated the old woman meekly. June went out to the stable with the milking pail. Her father had spread fodder for the cow, and she could hear the rasping of the ears of corn against each other as he tumbled them into the trough for the old sorrel. She put her head against the cow's soft flank, and under her sinewy fingers Two streams of milk struck the bottom of the tin pail with such thundering loudness that she did not hear her father's step. But when she rose to make the beast put back her right leg, she saw him looking at her. "I'm going to milk her, Pap, after I'm gone." "That's the first time you thought of that?" June put her fleshed cheek back to the flank of the cow. It was not the first time she had thought of that. Her stepmother would milk, and if she were ill, her father or Loretta. She had not meant to ask that question. She was wondering when they would start. That was what she meant to ask, and she was glad that she had swerved. Breakfast was eaten in the usual silence by the boy and the man, June and the stepmother serving it, and waiting on the Lord that was and the Lord that was to be. And then the two females sat down. "Hurry up, June," said the old man, wiping his mouth and beard with the back of his hand. "Clear away the dishes and get ready. Hale said he'd meet us at the Pine an hour by sun, for I told him I had to get back to work. Hurry up now." June hurried up. She was too excited to eat anything, so she began to wash the dishes while her stepmother ate. Then she went into the living room to pack her things, and it didn't take long. She wrapped the doll Hale had given her in the extra petticoat, wound one pair of yarn stockings around a pair of coarse shoes, tied them up into one bundle, and she was ready. Her father appeared with the sorrel horse, caught up his saddle from the porch, threw it on, and stretched the blanket behind it as a pillion for June to ride on. "Let's go," he said. There is little or no demonstrativeness in the domestic relations of mountaineers. The kiss of courtship is the only one known. There were no good-byes, only that short "Let's go." June sprang behind her father from the porch. The stepmother handed her the bundle, which she clutched in her lap, and they simply rode away, the stepmother and Bub silently gazing after them. But June saw the boy's mouth working, and when she turned the thicket at the creek, she looked back at the two quiet figures, and a keen pain cut her heart. She shut her mouth closely, gripped her bundle more tightly, and the tears streamed down her face. But the man did not know. They climbed in silence. Sometimes her father dismounted where the path was steep, but June sat on the horse to hold the bundle, and thus they mounted through the mist and chill of the morning. A shout greeted them from the top of the little spur whence the big pine was visible, and up there they found Hale waiting. He had reached the pine earlier than they, and was coming down to meet them. "Hello, little girl," called Hale cheerily. "You didn't fail me, did you?" June shook her head and smiled. Her face was blue, and her little legs, dangling under the bundle, were shrinking from the cold. Her bonnet had fallen to the back of her neck, and he saw that her hair was parted and gathered in a psych knot at the back of her head, giving her a quaint old look when she stood on the ground in her crimson gown. Hale had not forgotten a pillion, and there the transfer was made. Hale lifted her behind his saddle and handed up her bundle. "I'll take good care of her," he said. "All right," said the old man, "and I'm coming over soon to fix up that coal matter, and I'll let you know how she's getting on." "All right. Good-bye," said Hale. "I wish you well," said the mountaineer. "Be a good girl, Junie, and do what Mr. Hale there tells ye." "All right, Pap." And thus they parted. June felt the power of Hale's big black horse with exultation the moment he started. "Now we're off," said Hale gaily, and he patted the little hand that was about his waist. "Give me that bundle." "I can carry it." "No, you can't. Not with me." And when he reached around for it and put it on the cantle of his saddle, June thrust her left hand into his overcoat pocket, and Hale laughed. "Loretta wouldn't ride with me this way." "Loretta ain't got much sense," drawled June complacently. "'Tain't no harm, but don't you tell me. I don't want to hear nothin' about Loretta anyway." Again Hale laughed, and June laughed too. Imp that she was just pretending to be jealous now. She could see the big pine over his shoulder. "I've knowed that tree since I was a little girl, since I was a baby," she said, and the tone of her voice was new to Hale. "Sister Sally used to tell me lots about that old tree." Hale waited, but she stopped again. "What did she tell you?" "She used to say hit was curious that hit could be way up here all alone, that she recollected it ever since she was a baby, and she used to come up here and talk to it, and she said sometimes she could hear just a whisperin' to her when she was down home in the cove." "What did she say it said?" "She said it was always a whisperin', 'Come, come, come.'" June crooned the words. "And after she died, I'd hear the folks sayin' as how she riz up in bed with her eyes right wide, and sayin', 'I hears it. It's a whisperin'. I hears it. Come, come, come.'" And still Hale kept quiet when she stopped again. "The Red Fox said it was the spirits, but I knowed when they told me that she was a thinkin' of the old tree there. But I never let on. I reckon that's one reason made me come here that day." They were close to the big tree now, and Hale dismounted to fix his girth for the descent. "Well, I'm mighty glad you came, little girl. I might never seen you." "That's so," said June. "I saw the print of your foot in the mud right there." "Did ye?" "And if I hadn't, I might never have gone down into Lonesome Cove." June laughed. "You ran from me," Hale went on. "Yes, I did, and that's why you follered me." Hale looked up quickly. Her face was demure, but her eyes danced. She was an aged little thing. "Why did you run?" "I thought your fishing pole was a rifle gun, and that you was a raider." Hale laughed. "I see. Remember when you let your horse drink?" Hale nodded. "Well, I was on the rock above the creek looking down at ye, and I seed ye catching miners, and I thought you was going up the crick looking fer a still." "Weren't you afraid of me then?" "Huh?" she said contemptuously. "I wasn't afeard of you at all, 'cept for what you might find out. You couldn't do no harm to nobody without a gun, and I knowed there wasn't no still up that crick." I knowed where it was." Hale noticed the quick change of tense. "Won't you take me up to see it sometime?" "No," she said sharply, and Hale knew he had made a mistake. It was too steep for both to ride now, so he tied the bundle to the cantle with the leather strings and started leading the horse. June pointed to the edge of the cliff. "I was layin' flat right there, and I seed you comin' down there. My, but you look funny to me. You don't now," she said hastily. "You look mighty nice to me now." "You're a little rascal," said Hale. "That's what you are." The little girl bubbled with laughter, and then she grew mock serious. "No, I ain't." "Yes, you are," he repeated, shaking his head, and both were silent for a while. June was going to begin her education now, and it was just as well for him to begin with it now. So he started vaguely when he was mounted again. "June, you thought my clothes were funny when you first saw them, didn't you?" "Uh-huh," said June. "But you like them now?" "Uh-huh," she crooned again. "Well, some people who weren't used to clothes that people wear over in the mountains might think them funny for the same reason, mightn't they?" June was silent for a moment. "Well, maybe I like your clothes better because I like you better," she said, and Hale laughed. "Well, it's just the same. The way people in the mountains dress and talk is different from the way people outside dress and talk. It doesn't make much difference about clothes, though. I guess you will want to be as much like people over there as you can." "I don't know," interrupted the little girl shortly. "I ain't seen 'em yit." "Well," laughed Hale, "you will want to talk like them anyhow, because everybody who is learning tries to talk the same way." June was silent, and Hale plunged unconsciously on. "Up at the Pine now, you said, 'I seed you when I was a layin' on the edge of the cliff.' Now, you ought to have said, 'I saw you when I was lying.'" "I wasn't," she said sharply. "I don't tell lies." Her hand shot from his waist, and she slid suddenly to the ground. He pulled in his horse and turned a bewildered face. She had lighted on her feet and was poised back above him like an enraged eaglet, her thin nostrils quivering, her mouth as tight as a bowstring, and her eyes 2 points of fire. "Why, June, if you don't like my clothes and the way I talk, I reckon I'd better go back home." With a groan, Hale tumbled from his horse. Fool that he was, he had forgotten the sensitive pride of the mountaineer. Even while he was thinking of that pride, he knew that fun might be made of her speech and her garb by her schoolmates over at the Gap, and he was trying to prepare her, to save her mortification, to make her understand. "Why, June, little girl, I didn't mean to hurt your feelings. You don't understand. You can't now, but you will. Trust me, won't you? I like you just as you are. I love the way you talk. But other people, forgive me, won't you?" He pleaded, "I'm sorry. I wouldn't hurt you for the world." She didn't understand. She hardly heard what he said, but she did know his distress was genuine, and his sorrow. And his voice melted her fierce little heart. The tears began to come, while she looked, and when he put his arms about her, she put her face on his breast and sobbed. "There now," he said soothingly. "It's all right now. I'm so sorry, so very sorry." And he patted her on the shoulder and laid his hand across her temple and hair and pressed her head tight to his breast. Almost as suddenly she stopped sobbing, and loosening herself, turned away from him. "I'm a fool, that's what I am," she said hotly. "No, you aren't. Come on, little girl. We're friends again, aren't we?" June was digging at her eyes with both hands. "Aren't we?" "Yes," she said with an angry little catch of her breath, and she turned submissively to let him lift her to her seat. Then she looked down into his face. "Jack," she said, and he started again at the frank address. "I never going to do that no more." "Yes, you are, little girl," he said soberly, but cheerily. "You're going to do it whenever I'm wrong, or whenever you think I'm wrong." She shook her head seriously. "No, Jack." In a few minutes they were at the foot of the mountain, on a level road. "Hold tight," Hale shouted. "I'm going to let him out now." At the touch of his spur, the big black horse sprang into a gallop, faster and faster, until he was pounding the hard road in a swift run like thunder. At the creek, Hale pulled in and looked around. June's bonnet was down, her hair was tossed, her eyes were sparkling fearlessly, and her face was flushed with joy. "Like it, June?" "I never did know nothing like it." "You weren't scared?" "Scared of what?" she asked, and Hale wondered if there was anything of which she would be afraid. They were entering the gap now, and June's eyes got big with wonder over the mighty upshooting peaks and the rushing torrent. "See that big rock yonder, June?" June craned her neck to follow with her eyes his outstretched finger. "Uh-huh." "Well, that's called Bee Rock, because it's covered with flowers, purple rhododendrons and laurel, and bears used to go there for wild honey. They say that once on a time folk around here put whiskey in the honey, and the bears got so drunk that people came and knocked 'em in the head with clubs." "Well, what do you think of that?" said June wonderingly. Before them a big mountain loomed, and a few minutes later, at the mouth of the gap, Hale stopped and turned his horse sideways. "There you are, June," he said. June saw the lovely little valley rimmed with big mountains. She could follow the course of the two rivers that encircled it by the trees that fringed their banks, and she saw smoke rising here and there, and that was all. She was a little disappointed. "Mighty purty," she said. "I never seed." She paused, but went on without correcting herself. "So much level land in all my life." The morning mail had just come in as they rode by the post office, and several men hailed her escort, and all started with some wonder at her. Hale smiled to himself, drew up for none, but put on a face of utter unconsciousness that he was doing anything unusual. June felt vaguely uncomfortable. Ahead of them, when they turned the corner of the street, her eyes fell on a strange, tall red house with yellow trimmings, that was not built of wood and had two sets of windows, one above the other, and before that Hale drew up. "Here we are. Get down, little girl." "Good morning," said a voice. Hale looked around and flushed, and June looked around and stared, transfixed as by a vision from another world, at the dainty figure behind them, in a walking suit, a short skirt that showed 2 little feet in laced tan boots, and a cap with a plume, under which was a pair of wide blue eyes with long lashes and a mouth that suggested active mischief and gentle mockery. "Good morning," said Hale, and he added gently, "Get on, June." The little girl slipped to the ground and began pulling her bonnet on with both hands, but the newcomer had caught sight of the psyche knot that made June look like a little old woman, strangely young, and the mockery at her lips was gently accentuated by her smile. Hale swung from his saddle. "This is the little girl I told you about, Miss Anne," he said. "She's come over to go to school." Instantly, almost, Miss Anne had been melted by the forlorn-looking little creature who stood before her, shy for the moment, and dumb, and She came forward with her gloved hand outstretched. But June had seen that smile. She gave her hand, and Miss Anne straightway was no little surprised. There was no more shyness in the dark eyes that blazed from the recesses of the sunbonnet, and Miss Anne was so startled when she looked into them that all she could say was, "Dear me!" A pretty woman with a kind face appeared at the door of the red brick house and came to the gate. "Here she is, Mrs. Crane," called Hale. "Howdy, June," cried the Widow Crane kindly. "Come in." In her June knew straightway she had a friend, and she picked up her bundle and followed upstairs, the first real stairs she had ever seen, and into a room to the floor of which was a rag carpet. There was a bed in one corner and a white counterpane and a washstand with a bowl and pitcher, which, too, she had never seen before. "Make yourself at home right now," said the Widow Crane, pulling open a drawer under a big looking-glass, "and put your things here. That's your bed." And out she went. How clean it was! There were some flowers in a glass vase on the mantel. There were white curtains at the big window, and a bed to herself, her own bed. She went over to the window. There was a steep bank lined with rhododendrons. Right under it there was a mill dam below, and down the stream she could hear the creaking of a water wheel, and she could see it dripping and shining in the sun. A grist mill! She thought of Uncle Billy and old Hun, and in spite of a little pang of homesickness, she felt no loneliness at all. "I knew she would be pretty," said Miss Anne at the gate outside. "Told you she was pretty," said Hale. "But not so pretty as that," said Miss Anne. "We will be great friends." "I hope so, for her sake," said Hale. Hale waited till noon recess was nearly over, and then he went to take June to the schoolhouse. He was told that she was in her room, and he went up and knocked on the door. There was no answer, for one does not knock on doors for entrance in the mountains, and thinking he had made a mistake, he was about to try another room when June opened the door to see what the matter was. She gave him a glad smile. "Come on," he said, and when she went for her bonnet, he stepped into the room. "How do you like it?" June nodded toward the window, and Hale went to it. "There's Uncle Billy's mill out there." "Why, so it is," said Hale, smiling. "That's fine." The schoolhouse, to June's wonder, had shingles on the outside around all the walls from roof to foundation, and a big bell hung on top of it under a little shingled roof of its own. A pale little man with spectacles and blue pale eyes met them at the door, and he gave June a pale slender hand and cleared his throat before he spoke to her. "She's never been to school," said Hale. "She can read and spell, but she's not very strong on arithmetic." "Very well, I'll turn her over to the primary." The school bell sounded. Hale left with a parting prophecy. "You'll be proud of her some day," at which June blushed, and then with a beating heart she followed the little man into his office. A few minutes later the assistant came in, and she was none other than the wonderful young woman whom Hale had called Miss Anne. There were a few instructions in halting voices and with much clearing of the throat from the pale little man, and a moment later June walked the gauntlet of the eyes of her schoolmates, every one of whom looked up from his book to hers to watch her as she went to her seat. Miss Anne pointed out the arithmetic lesson, and without lifting her eyes, June bent with a flushed face to her task. It was reddened with shame when she was called to the class, for she sat on the bench taller by a head and more than any of the boys and girls thereon, except one awkward youth who caught her eye and grinned with unashamed companionship. The teacher noticed her look and understood with a sudden keen sympathy, and naturally she was struck by the fact that the new pupil was the only one who never missed an answer. She won't be there long, Miss Anne thought, and she gave June a smile for which the little girl was almost grateful. June spoke to no one, but walked through her schoolmates homeward, when school was over, like a haughty young queen. Miss Anne had gone ahead and was standing at the gate talking with Miss Crane, and the young woman spoke to June most kindly. "Mr. Hale has been called away on business," she said, and June's heart sank. "And I'm going to take care of you until he comes back." "I'm much obliged," she said, and while she was not ungracious, her manner indicated her belief that she could take care of herself, and Miss Anne felt uncomfortably that this extraordinary young person was steadily measuring her from head to foot. June saw the smart, close-fitting gown, the dainty little boots, and the carefully brushed hair. She noticed how white her teeth were, and her hands, and she saw the nails look polished, and that the tips of them were like little white crescents, and she could still see every detail when she sat at her window, looking down at the old mill. She saw Mr. Hale when he left, the young lady had said, and she had a headache now and was going home to lie down. She understood now what Hale meant on the mountainside when she was so angry with him. She was learning fast, and the most from the two persons who were not conscious what they were teaching her. And she would learn in the school, too, for the slumbering ambition in her suddenly became passionately definite now. She went to the mirror and looked at her hair. She would learn how to plait that in two braids down her back, as the other schoolgirls did. She looked at her hands, and straightway she fell to scrubbing them with soap as she had never scrubbed them before. As she worked, she heard her name called, and she opened the door. "Yes, ma'am," she answered, for already she had picked that up in the schoolroom. "Come on, June, and go down the street with me." "Yes, ma'am," she repeated, and she wiped her hands and hurried down. Mrs. Crane had looked through the girl's pathetic wardrobe while she was at school that afternoon, had told Hale before he left, and she had a surprise for little June. Together they went down the street and into the chief store in town, and, to June's amazement, Mrs. Crane began ordering things for this little girl. "Who's a going to pay for all those things?" whispered June aghast. "Don't you bother, honey. Mr. Hale said he would fix all that with your pappy. It's some coal deal or something. Don't you bother." And June, in a quiver of happiness, didn't bother. Stockings, petticoats, some soft stuff for a new dress, and tan shoes that looked like the ones that wonderful young woman wore, and then some long white things. "What's them for?" she whispered. But the clerk heard her and laughed, whereat Mrs. Crane gave him such a glance that he retired quickly. "Nightgowns, honey." "You sleep in 'em?" said June in an awed voice. "That's just what you do," said the good old woman, hardly less pleased than June. "My, but you got pretty feet. I wish they were half as pretty as—" "Well, they are," interrupted Mrs. Crane, a little snappishly. Apparently she did not like Miss Anne. "Wrap 'em up, and Mr. Hale will attend to the bill." "All right," said the clerk, looking much mystified. Outside the door June looked up into the beaming goggles of the Honorable Samuel Budd. "Is this the little girl? Howdy, June," he said, and June put her hand in the Honorable Sam's with a sudden trust in his voice. "I'm going to help you take care of you, too," said Mr. Budd, and June smiled at him with shy gratitude. How kind everybody was. "I'm much obleeged," she said, and she and Mrs. Crane went on back with their bundles. June's hands so trembled when she found herself alone with her treasures that she could hardly unpack them. When she had folded and laid them away, she had to unfold them and look at them again. She hurried to bed that night merely that she might put on one of those wonderful nightgowns, and again she had to look all her treasures over. She was glad she had brought the doll, because he had given it to her, but she said to herself, "I'm getting too big now for dolls," and she put it away. Then she set the lamp on the mantelpiece so that she could see herself in her wonderful nightgown. She let her shining hair fall like molten gold around her shoulders, and she wondered whether she could ever look like the dainty creature that just now was the model she so passionately wanted to be like. Then she blew out the lamp and sat a while by the window, looking down through the rhododendrons at the shining water and the old water-wheel, sleepily at rest in the moonlight. She knelt down then at her bedside to say her prayers, as her dead sister had taught her to do, and she asked God to bless Jack, wondering as she prayed that she had heard nobody else call him Jack. And then she lay down with her breast heaving. She had told him she would never do that again, but she couldn't help it now. The tears came, and from happiness she cried herself softly to sleep. End of chapter 12.